So hello, everybody, and welcome. Really good to see good, friendly faces on the screen. And it's an auspicious start, actually, to start with the technological era. So we missed the video, we couldn't get the sound going, and now that's going to give us a good session. So welcome to this session on data for locally led adaptation. I'm going to give you a bit of a history of why we're here, what we hope to discuss, etc. As some of you will know, last year in December, the Global Hub on Locally Led Adaptation was launched by the Prime Minister of Bangladesh in Dhaka in December. And while we were sort of thinking through the Global Hub, we definitely knew that, one of the elements would be the interesting case studies and stories of actual adaptation happening on the ground, and as sort of highlighting and spotlighting the local champions of adaptation. But then we also sort of wondered whether there should be a data element to it. Should there be a data platform? And at that point, we were working, thanks to Sheilaji, who's on the call, we were working in Mukuru. And one thing that became very clear to us was that one of the key successes in Mukuru, which, if you don't know, was a planning process that took place in an urban informal settlement. There's a guide here. So this was the launch of the Global Hub that Shireen's put on right now, just to say that we've got different language versions on the top. So you can actually switch languages. It's not the perfect translation, but it's actually not bad either. So you do get the case studies, etc., that we've got. And this is something we're hoping to expand. So this has just been 4 months, but we're hoping that this database will expand. So to go back, so what we were doing at that point, working with Sheilaji and with the group in Mukuru in Nairobi, was to document the deeply participatory planning process that took place in over a period of about 3 years, and sort of documenting it to inform similar processes elsewhere, because there were many, many things that were wonderful about it. You can read all about it. We have the guide now online. We've got a lot of videos there. We actually have a session on it tomorrow morning. So join us for more details. We'll have the team from Mukuru there. So while we were documenting this, something that we understood, and Sheilaji has been trying to, I know, explain this to people over and over, is that the whole process of data collection itself by communities is really key and important and empowering for communities. So it's something that, they need to do to be able to understand their own risks and vulnerabilities. And then having put that together, not only convinces them of the need to work as a community rather than an individual. They see sort of the benefit of working together, but also gives them leveraging power over the government, because then they've got the data and the facts to prove what they're saying. So this was really interesting, and we got talking, and then we were sort of trying to figure out, that this is happening in Mukuru. It's also happening in a lot of other places where SDI works, but it's also happening in places where communities are doing vulnerability and risk assessments, that they're sort of mapping their risks and vulnerabilities, they're generating this information and data, and to some extent, maybe it's not getting the attention or the importance that it deserves. So we started looking into the question of, should there be ways of, documenting this, because it's a really important baseline, and it's a really important peer-to-peer learning experience for other communities. And then, of course, we found that, that there may be issues of privacy, whether or not this data should be shared publicly, what level of data can be shared publicly, what the format is, how do you make it usable, and how do you make sure that it actually addresses needs, because lots of people have data platforms, but invariably they fall by the wayside. So we wanted to sort of scope this, and that's what Mathematica is doing for us right now. But for us, I mean, the key next step, I think, is to go through the process, each element of the process that communities go through, and look at community needs in terms of data, but also what they generate and how we can support those processes for generating that data. So for instance, in the beginning, when they're understanding their climate risks and when the planning takes place, they definitely need support and help from external agencies on providing them with that kind of sort of modeling and the climate predictions and forecasts, etc. And that, I mean, has to be done in a way that it's not a one-off, that they have regular access to this kind of information. So what's key there probably is to make the right kind of linkages with local institutions with which they can work. Then as they move into actual implementation and monitoring, I think there we have a job to do in terms of changing the way the monitoring happens. So this has been said often, but the monitoring needs to happen in a way that's useful for the communities themselves to draw lessons from and to inform course correction, inform how they design future, so their own learning. And again, it's data that perhaps communities need to collect themselves, with support externally, perhaps for analysis, etc. But again, done in a way that it's a local organization and institution that can then support them consistently in future, because it's not a one and done process. So a lot of this, as I said, is documented in that guide, which we'll talk about more in detail. But the other element that I think is interesting is that invariably, whether it's the SDG process or climate change vulnerability, there are a lot of so-called top-down processes that gather data. And I think it would be really interesting to see how they match up to, or how they align with the data that communities collect. Sheilaji told me once that she's convinced that they tell completely different stories. So she'll probably tell you that. But I think that is also key, that how is there a role for us to sort of somehow try to make those two talk to each other. So these are really interesting questions that we hope to explore with you today and ongoing in the future as well, because Mathematica today is more or less a start of the process, but they'll be in touch with many of you with questionnaires, etc., to get your feedback. So I'll now pass on to Tulika Narayan, who's the Vice President of Climate Change at Mathematica, and she'll give you a bit of a background of what they're doing and then also introduce the other speakers and moderate the sessions. Thanks, Tulika. Thanks for moderating, and over to you.
Thanks a lot, Anju, and thanks for setting the stage really nicely. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. As Anju mentioned, I'm leading climate change practice at Mathematica, which is a mission-oriented social policy firm based in the US that works to bring our expertise at the intersection of social policy, data science, and technology to improve the impact of climate interventions. And we're particularly committed to bringing reliable evidence to support locally led adaptation, to improve climate resilience outcomes, and to measure those outcomes rigorously. So this scoping review is that we're conducting in partnership with GCA is very aligned with our mission. And through this conversation, we're hoping to kickstart our effort, as Anju mentioned, to identify the challenges faced by communities and local governments in accessing the downscale data, the global data that's available on weather and climate information, to understand the data that is coming from the communities themselves, and also importantly, to understand the climate finance funding flows that are available. And overall, this activity will help us assess the potential and opportunities to bring together a platform at the global hub that communities and stakeholders can access. So eager to get started with this roundtable discussion. And we're an exciting group of participants today. We'll start with some opening remarks by each of them. And the remarks are going to be structured around the 4 broad areas of the scoping review, which is to understand the data needs of the communities and local governments, to also recognize the data that is coming from the activities that are happening at the local level and supporting the data collection needs, and also finding ways to integrate it into this evidence base. And then understanding the key challenges that are there in making this, top-down and bottom-up data available, accessible, and usable. And then this piece on tracking climate finance flows to inform such local planning efforts. So this whole activity is very much within the principles of locally led adaptation, which was agreed upon, which is devolving decision-making to the lowest appropriate level. And to do that, I think the most critical piece is to bring the evidence that is necessary to make the best decisions. And I see this activity very much aligned with that principle. And in the spirit of the other principle of LLA, which is in the spirit of collaboration, it's just essential that we begin the conversation by speaking with the community leader, a person who works closely with the community. So the first speaker today will be Sabrina Parveen, who's a local resident of Khulna, the president of the Community Development Forum in Khulna, also the president of Khulna Nagar Unnayan Forum and Mahila Shomboy Samiti. And through her work, she works tirelessly to with her staff to understand by going house to house, understanding what the challenges are and what are the solutions that may be appropriate given the context that they're working in. So we'll start with comments from her and tee that up to bring in Shuchi Vora, who can also speak to the community needs, data community needs, because of her role as a Resilience Knowledge Coalition lead, where she drives a community of practice at the interface of research, policy, and practice. So she is able to connect the research work along with how to bring that research and knowledge to use. And she has a decade of experience in resilience programming and has also set up multi-stakeholder forums, facilitating transdisciplinary research, all to support locally led adaptation. And I think she's worked in urban and rural contexts in South Asia and East Africa. So we really are looking forward to bring light to that particular aspect also along with Sabrina. Then we'll tee up Anthony D'Agostino. You all can wave as I'm introducing you to. Anthony is a principal researcher here at Mathematica, and during this time, he has done a lot of climate change research and has interfaced with global data and will be speaking about the ability to downscale this climate data. And over his time at Mathematica, has worked on a variety of climate adaptation interventions, has studied the impact of weather on crop yields, solar microgrids, energy use patterns, and overall has led a lot of research and evaluation efforts here at Mathematica. And before Mathematica, he was also at Stanford, a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford, and has been published in leading journals. Then following that, we'll tee up a conversation on climate adaptation finance flows, the conditions under which those finance flows may be available to sub-national local stakeholders. Anand Patwardhan is a professor and senior fellow at the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland. And his research is focused in the area of environment, climate, focusing on mitigation and adaptation responses to climate change. He's also been the member of the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel of the Global Environmental Facility, and also the co-director of Adaptation Research Alliance. So those are our speakers today, and I want to then welcome Sabrina to open up the conversation with comments about her work in Khulna, the data that she generates, and the needs that she has for data. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Tulika. So I'll now switch to Bangla for the ease of Sabrina to, speak comfortably, and then I can translate whatever she says for all of you. Sabrina, আপনি যদি একটু আপনার মাইক আর ভিডিওটা অন করেন। থ্যাংক ইউ আপা, আপনি যদি আপনার পরিচয়টা দিয়ে একটু শুরু করেন এবং আপনি কোথায় কাজ করেন, এরপরে যে তিনটা প্রশ্নের কথা তুলিকা বললো একটার পর একটা আমি জিজ্ঞেস করলে আপনি একটু উত্তর করেন, আর একটা একটা করে আমি তাহলে ট্রান্সলেট করে দিব, ঠিক আছে? আপনি একটু আপনার পরিচয়টা দিয়ে শুরু করেন।
আসসালামু আলাইকুম, সবাইকে শুভ সন্ধ্যা। আমি সাবরিনা পারভিন, আমি খুলনা নগর উন্নয়ন মহিলা সমবায় সমিতির সভাপতি এবং 13 নং ওয়ার্ডের সালেরমার সিডিওর সভাপতি হিসেবে কাজ করছি। আমি আন্তরিকভাবে সকলের কাছে কৃতজ্ঞ যে এত সুন্দর একটি প্ল্যাটফর্মে আমাকে কথা বলতে সুযোগ দেওয়ার জন্য। আচ্ছা,
আমি এটা ট্রান্সলেট করে নিই আপা, আপনার পরিচয়টা বলে নিই। So she's Sabrina Parveen. She is the president of the Khulna Women Cooperatives and also the president of the Community Development Organization at the Ward Nong 13th of Khulna. She is delighted to join us all here today, and she's really thankful that the platform recognizes her and has given her a chance to speak about her work and the community. জি আপা বলেন, প্রথম যে প্রশ্নটা একটু আপনার থেকে জানতে চাই যে আপনি যেখানে কাজ করছেন কমিউনিটি ডেভেলপমেন্ট অর্গানাইজেশন, সেখানে আসলে এলাকার পরিস্থিতিটা একটু কি, ওদের কি জলবায়ু পরিবর্তন জনিত সমস্যা, সেগুলি যদি একটু বলেন, এবং কিভাবে আসলে আপনারা কমিউনিটিকে একত্রিত করে এই যে কমিউনিটি অ্যাকশন প্ল্যানটা তৈরি করেন, সেই প্ল্যান থেকে কি কি তথ্য পান সেটা যদি একটু বলেন।
আমাদের কমিউনিটিতে আসলে কাজের শুরুতেই জরিপের মাধ্যমে একটা ম্যাপ তৈরি করা হয়। এই ম্যাপের মাধ্যমে সিডিও এলাকার মানে কমিউনিটি এলাকার ভিতরে অবস্থিত প্রতিটি লোকেশন চিহ্নিত করা হয় এই ম্যাপের মাধ্যমে। যেমন সিডিও এলাকার ভিতরে কোথায় কোথায় মসজিদ, মাদ্রাসা, স্কুল, হাসপাতাল, শিল্প প্রতিষ্ঠান, তারপরে ব্যবসা প্রতিষ্ঠান, উন্নয়নমূলক কর্মকাণ্ডগুলো চিহ্নিত করা হয়। আমাদের এই কমিউনিটিতে আসলে আমি যে এলাকায় বসবাস করি সেই এলাকাটায় যখন মানে জলবায়ু পরিবর্তনের কারণে বিভিন্ন সময় এলাকার ভিতরে যেসব এলাকায় বস্তি ও নিম্ন আয়ের লোকজন বসবাস করে তাদের অধিকাংশ ঘরগুলো কিন্তু কাঁচা এবং টিন শেডের, যার কারণে যখন প্রচন্ড গরম হয় এখানে তখন ঘরগুলোর ভিতরে অতিরিক্ত গরম হওয়ার কারণে মানে প্রচন্ড টিনগুলো হিট হয়ে যায়, তখন তারা ভিতরে বসবাস করতে পারে না, গরমে বসবাস করতে পারে না। এবং দিনে এবং রাতে তারা কিন্তু ঘুমাতেও পারে না। তখন দেখা যায় ঘর থেকে বের হয়ে তারা কিন্তু পাশে যদি কোনো গাছ থাকে বা বড় মানে বিল্ডিং থাকে সেখানে যে ছায়ায় তারা বিশ্রাম নেয়। এবং সকালে কিন্তু তারা এত ক্লান্ত থাকে শারীরিক পরিশ্রমের জন্য, মানে ক্লান্তর জন্য সকালে তারা কিন্তু কাজেও অনেক সময় যেতে পারে না। আর কেউ কেউ আমাদের এই এলাকায় দেখা যাচ্ছে কেউ কেউ মানে মহিলারা বাসা বাড়িতে কাজ করে, কেউ দেখা যাচ্ছে যে রিক্সা চালায়, আবার এরকম বিভিন্ন ধরনের নিম্ন আয়ের লোকজন আমাদের এলাকায় এখানে থাকে। তারপরে এখানে জলবায়ু পরিবর্তনের কারণে আমাদের বিশেষ করে এলাকায় যে পানির ব্যবস্থা মানে প্রচন্ড পানিতে প্রচন্ড লবণাক্ত যেটা খাওয়ার অনুপযোগী, যার কারণে এই পানি এবং প্রচন্ড আয়রন, এই পানি যখন তারা মানে খাবার পানিটা খায় আসলে আমাদের এখানে ডিপ টিউবওয়েলও মানে সেইভাবে যদি পোতা হয় তাহলে সেটার পানিও ভালো আসে না, যার কারণে পানিটা মানে ব্যবহারের অনুপযোগী। তারপরে যখন প্রচন্ড পরিমাণে অনেক বৃষ্টি হয় তখন দেখা যায় যে বৃষ্টির কারণে যেহেতু আমাদের এখানে ঘরগুলো নিচু, রাস্তা থেকে নিচু ঘরগুলো, ওই বৃষ্টি হওয়ার সময় রাস্তার ড্রেনের ময়লা পানি ঘরের ভিতরে কিন্তু প্রবেশ করে, যার ফলে বস্তি এলাকার অধিকাংশ লোকজনই বিভিন্ন ধরনের পানিবাহিত রোগে আক্রান্ত হয়। আপা আমি কি এবারে
বলে নিব আপা?
হ্যাঁ বলে দিন।
So I asked her like what are the processes that they follow in terms of mobilizing the communities and coming up with the community action plan to generate data. So to start with, she actually highlighted what are the actual problems and vulnerabilities in their location. So if you know, Khulna is a coastal town in Bangladesh which is very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So as she was mentioning, the low-income communities living in the urban informal settlements actually live in a very volatile and vulnerable situation. The housing structures are quite poor, and during the summer the tin shaded structures actually trap a lot of heat, which actually make their life unbearable, and due to that exhaustion of the heat they can't even go, like they can't work full-time during the summer. And since their housing structure is not properly built considering the flood level and all that, so when there is heavy rainfall there is flooding, and oftentimes their houses and even the community roads get inundated, and that actually also hampers the communication among them. And when the flood water actually also enters into their premises, that actually also leads to different waterborne diseases among the children and the women. আপা এখন যদি একটু আপনি আপনার যে কমিউনিটি ডেভেলপমেন্ট ম্যাপটা কিভাবে তৈরি করেন সে বিষয়ে যদি একটু বলেন।
আচ্ছা, কমিউনিটিতে প্রাথমিকভাবে জরিপের মাধ্যমে প্রাথমিক দল গঠন করা হয়। এভাবে 21 থেকে 22টা পিজি দল গঠন করা হয়। পিজি দল থেকে একজন করে নেত্রী নিয়ে একটি কমিটি গঠন করা হয়। এই কমিটির নামই হচ্ছে সিডিও। এই সিডিও কমিটি প্রত্যেক মাসে মাসিক মিটিং একবার করে। তারপরে এই মাসিক মিটিং এ কমিউনিটির কি কি সুবিধা অসুবিধা আছে সেগুলো নিয়ে আলোচনা করা হয়। এরপর কমিউনিটির নেত্রীরা একটি অ্যাকশন প্ল্যান তৈরি করে, যেটা 1 বছরের জন্য করা হয়। এই অ্যাকশন প্ল্যানে আর্থসামাজিক ও অবকাঠামোগত চিত্র তুলে ধরা হয়। তারপর এই অ্যাকশন প্ল্যান এলাকার স্থানীয় প্রতিনিধির সামনে উপস্থাপন করা হয়। এই প্ল্যানে যে সমস্যাগুলো সমাধান আগে প্রয়োজন সেটা চলে আসে। এই সমস্যাগুলো কতদিনে সমাধান করা যাবে, কাদের সাথে লিঙ্কেজ করলে সমাধান দ্রুত পাওয়া যাবে, তারপরে হচ্ছে কারা মনিটরিং করবে, কিভাবে মনিটরিং করবে, এই সব কিছু নিয়েই আসলে আমরা কমিউনিটি অ্যাকশন প্ল্যানটা তৈরি করি।
ধন্যবাদ আপা। So then I asked like how she together with the community women actually deal with the problem, what do they do? So she mentioned that they actually, you can also see the slides which she has kindly provided, is like how they come up with the community action plan. Basically together with the community, they first start the survey, what they are calling it, and they go door to door in each of the household in the community and identify what are the challenges that they are facing. And from the door-to-door household survey, they then form the primary groups consisting of the few members who show the leadership, and they form the primary groups. And from the primary groups, they ultimately form the community development committees, who actually lead the process, which is then identifying what are the major the impacts of climate change, and then also what are the impacts of this climate change in different sectors. Could be on livelihoods, could be on household structures, could be on drinking water surveys. And then they also prioritize, as you can see in the slides, that they first identify the whole list of impacts and the sectors, and then based on voting, they also identify what are their the priority challenges and what could be the way forward. So in the last plan, if you can see in the left bottom slide, they develop actually this plan where they actually identify solutions and also identify who are the potential stakeholders who can be important in solving the problems. And they also go to the local governments and the local political leaders with their maps, so that they could also influence them in providing the solutions the community is opting for. আপা, এখন যদি জিজ্ঞেস করি যে আপনারা যে এই কাজগুলো করছেন, এই যে তথ্যগুলো আবিষ্কার করছেন আপনাদের এই যে ম্যাপ থেকে, এই ম্যাপ থেকে যে কি কি তথ্য পাচ্ছেন এবং সেই তথ্যগুলা ভবিষ্যতে আরো কাজে লাগানোর জন্য আপনাদের কি বাহিরের কারো থেকে অন্য কোনো ধরনের তথ্য সহযোগিতা প্রয়োজন কিনা?
আসলে আপা, আমরা যখন এলাকায় কাজ করি, আমরা নিজেরাও কাজ করি এবং বিভিন্ন সময় সরকারি, বেসরকারি, তারপরে বিভিন্ন সেবামূলক প্রতিষ্ঠান, বিভিন্ন বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়, বৈশ্বিক সংস্থাগুলো, কমিউনিটিতে আমরা যখন ক্যাপের কাজ করি, আসলে তখন যদি তাদের মানে প্রযুক্তিগত সহায়তাটা আমরা পাই, তাহলে হয়তো আমাদের এই কাজগুলো করতে আরো সহজ হয়ে যায়।
Acha. So then I asked like what the data they actually create. So from the maps, you can see the photos that the community members are doing the maps. And if you can see the maps, she mentioned that from the map, they can already identify like what are the vulnerable roads which are clogged, or, could be, drainage clogged during the waterlogging, and, what are the vulnerable locations, which households are the most vulnerable. They identify these solutions. And then I asked like what are the additional needs that you in terms of data that you want from other external stakeholders. So she mentioned that they also collaborate and share their map with other NGOs or international NGOs or even universities for that matter, and try to engage with them how they can and their need is if they can provide them with like technological support in terms of accessing maybe the early warning better, rightly on time, or even to digitize the map. So that is their need going forward. এবং ফাইনালি আপনার শেষ প্রশ্ন যেটা, যে আপনার কি মনে হয় যে কমিউনিটিরা আপনারা মিলে যে তথ্য উপাত্তগুলো তৈরি করছেন সেটার গ্রহণযোগ্যতাটা বাড়াতে ভবিষ্যতে মানুষের কাছে আরো বেশি গ্রহণযোগ্য করতে কি করা উচিত?
আমরা যখন আসলে এই কমিউনিটি অ্যাকশন প্ল্যানটা করা হয় 1 বছরের জন্য, আসলে সরকারিভাবে বা বেসরকারিভাবে সেবামূলক প্রতিষ্ঠানগুলো যখন কাজ করে, তাদেরও নিশ্চয়ই একটা প্ল্যান থাকে, অ্যাকশন প্ল্যান থাকে। তা আমাদের এই অ্যাকশন প্ল্যানে যেগুলো থাকে আমাদের এই প্ল্যানটা এবং তাদের প্ল্যানের সাথে একসাথে যদি অন্তর্ভুক্ত করা হয়, যেমন আমাদের এখানে সিটি পর্যায়ে, তারপরে পৌরসভা, এসব জায়গায় যদি আমাদের কমিউনিটির এই প্ল্যানের যেসব তথ্য এগুলা যদি তাদের সাথে একসাথে অন্তর্ভুক্ত করা হয়, তাহলে মনে হয় আমাদের কমিউনিটির এই প্ল্যানের গ্রহণযোগ্যতা আরো বাড়বে এবং আমাদের কাজ করতে সুবিধা হবে। আর প্রত্যেকটা আর এসব কাজ করার পরও সবচেয়ে বড় কথা হলো যে আসলে খুব মনিটরিংটা বেশি প্রয়োজন। আমার মনে হয় যে কোনো কাজ যখন আমরা করি তখন মনিটরিংটা বেশি প্রয়োজন, যাতে প্রত্যেকটা কাজ সঠিকভাবে সঠিক নিয়মে হয়। আমরা যারা কমিউনিটিতে কাজ করি তারা যদি এই ধরনের মানে মানে এটাই আর কি, যে তাদের সাথে যদি একসাথে অন্তর্ভুক্ত করা হয় তাহলে আমাদের কাজটা আরো ভালো হবে এবং গ্রহণযোগ্যতাটাও এটা বাড়বে।
অনেক ধন্যবাদ আপা। So finally, I asked the last question, like how the data that they are generating can also support other stakeholders, in scaling up their work. So what she mentioned is that she's quite sure that other organizations like, the city level or the national level, NGOs, civil societies, or even the government, they also have their, work plan, and they also intend to, have that sort of process of community engagement. So if these organizations can, really take up their data, step by step from their community level to maybe the ward level, and then to the city level, the Poroshobha level, then their generated data can be really helpful for them also to actually know the ground reality. And that could also actually, legitimize the kind of data that communities are building, and then other stakeholders can also, feel the importance of the data that communities are generating. Thank you so much, Appa. I think, Tulika, over to you, unless you have any other questions.
No, thank you so much to you, Shireen, for translating, and Sabrina for that information. And actually hearing the presentation, it was so evident, I think, to me and hopefully to others, that there is just such richness of data, the level of detail that's coming out of the work. And as we were asking questions about what are the data needs, a lot of what I heard was how much there is available to actually contribute to the data systems more than the data needs itself. So that was quite incredible to get that detail. And thank you again, Dhanyavad, Sabrina. And Shuchi, if you could come in and speak to a little bit about, first of all, contextualize some of what Sabrina said from the experience you've had across other countries too. What does it look like? Is it different? Is it similar? Because these local contexts tend to be very different, very nuanced, right? And it seems like what I hear was there's so much information about how the climate impacts are felt. Say a little bit about that, but also a bit about what are the data needs? What is all this big data, global data that we talk about? What is the value of that for the communities? How do they perceive it, and what are the gaps? Thank you, Shuchi.
Thank you. Thanks. And thank you for having me here. I have been associated with the monitoring, evaluation, learning, resilience, evidence space through GRP for about a year now, but we've increasingly sharpened our focus towards locally led adaptation and how we monitor it, how we think about monitoring it, and our evidence needs for it. I also want to kind of plug in the evidence forum that we're doing in June, hopefully this year. We have some confusion around the dates, but as soon as they're out, I think we should be promoting that widely. Many of you should be getting emails from us with invites for the evidence forum, and there we're actually looking to broaden this conversation of what is measurement, what is resilience measurement, and what is evidence. In fact, a lot of us are trained to think about evidence in a particular way. We think of evidence, and I'm going to broaden this conversation around data needs to evidence needs, because a lot of what Sabrina said was also evidence. It was not just data, right? She was inputting into very clear forms of evidence through participatory planning and the kind of work that they're doing. And this is across the globe. Participatory planning methods are fairly fairly robust as methods used on the ground. I think where mindsets need a shift is how we look at them. Do we look at them as evidence or not? Do we look at communities? So it's I feel like it's more internal towards, and I'm kind of putting the lens back on the experts, the resilience experts, rather than on the communities, and challenging experts, in fact, being provocative and saying, are we looking at communities as users, producers of evidence, and decision makers based on that evidence? Are we only gearing evidence towards policymakers and donors, or are we gearing that evidence towards communities? The moment that lens shifts, a lot of our thinking around resilience evidence will also shift. That also brings with it questions around what is communities' agency like? Where are they? Are they already adapting? Yes, they are. Are they already, irrespective of how much data they have or how much evidence they have, whether it's maladaptation or, or adaptation for good, they are adapting already. I think where our job lies is to streamline that into utilizable evidence for them, so that they're not falling into vicious circles of, say, debt traps or farmer suicides or um, climate refugees, migration, conflict. So maladaptation is a reality for communities because they're already adapting, irrespective of the kind of data they have. And like just kind of stepping up from data to information and information to knowledge, and understanding each of these as different layers of the kind of evidence they need. It's fairly clear that they can be not just communities can not just plug into that data, so not just giving that data back, but also be creators, or also be disseminators and creators of information, and on top of it also be creators and disseminators of knowledge. So it's three layers that that we really need to unpack on evidence. And that's, I just like to allude to some of the work that we did in East Africa on modeling, and we used decision scaling because we realized there were large scale data gaps in when it came to downscaling. And if we downscale, we didn't have the kind of resolution that we needed for climate risk data. And so we used decision scaling, which kind of inverted that model. We started talking about if there is risk, then what? We went the other way. We didn't try and anticipate what risk existed, but we actually asked the question the other way around. If there's risk, how do you adapt to it? If there's risk, how do you respond to it? And then started building it from there, building scenarios from there. So that was one way. The other interesting piece of work that we did, and this was pre-COVID, both of these pieces pre-COVID.
You got the saman? She's gone yesterday. She went last.
I'll continue. Sorry. The other piece of work that we did was on participatory groundwater and ecosystem management, where we realized in India, and this is what the World Bank has also kind of picked up, based on some decades of work that different organizations have done, including us, have done across. And when I say us, it was me in a previous organization, but different organizations have worked on this, and there's a very clear evidence of communities being their own knowledge keepers of the groundwater that they use and that they manage, and therefore being able to manage their watersheds and their water demands in a way that they understand groundwater. So then they have the knowledge that they need on that, and acting as citizen scientists to be able to replicate that process across the country. So the aquifers may be different, so the data needs may be different. There might be and this is a very, very clear example of different data needs across, because each aquifer requires has very different recharge rates. Alluvial aquifers have fast recharge rates, but they are very large aquifers. So a lot of people using, sucking out, dipping straws in the same glass. for example. While hard rock aquifers can be very different, they can be a single straw in like a very deep, very large aquifer. So, and they have very slow recharge rates. So again, very different models of recharge, therefore very different data needs, but the knowledge to apply that data and the information that could be translated from that data, the moment those were given as weapons to the communities. And when I say weapons, I'm saying that they could use them rather than, or tools even for to the communities, that process replication was important. Then they were able to capture that data irrespective of the kind of aquifer they were working on, irrespective of the kind of land holding, irrespective of the kind of crops being grown, etc. So all of those were different data layers, but they were able to kind of make sense of that information, and because they had that knowledge. So just trying to kind of layer up from data needs to information to knowledge there, and therefore the evidence of community-led measurement approaches. So just two examples of work we've done in the past, and I think that kind of rallies on from what Sabrina was talking about as well, and the kind of rich data that comes out. And I think there's great value to recognizing and like, yeah, it's basically a challenge back to us. How do we recognize communities as users, producers of evidence, and decision makers based on that evidence as well? So I think I'll end there.
Thanks a lot, Shruti. Those are really helpful comments and really powerful statements there about the role of community and stakeholders. And very interesting what you said about decision scaling, particularly when there is uncertainty. And you're talking about the uncertainty and availability of data from the larger global climate databases. So I wanted to bring in Anthony now to get a little bit more sort of, get a sense of the big data out there, the data that sometimes we struggle to downscale at the right level for the communities, perhaps. And also, I think in the course of your presentation, maybe you'll be also speaking to how to address that uncertainty to some degree. And so, Anthony, over to you for conversation. I do have lots of questions teed up for all of you, so what we will do that after we go through the presentation. So, Anthony, I know you have slides.
Yes, great. Thanks, Tulika. And special thanks to the event and the panel organizers and the opportunity to talk with you all today. So I have some slides. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing them. So I think that what Sabrina and Shuchi has talked about is the data that's involved in thinking about the impacts that have been felt so far. And the data gaps and data availability that I would like to talk about are the climate data of thinking about future impacts. And this is going to provide an information stream that would inform future adaptation efforts. So this is the climate to come. And I think what we've been talking about so far is the climate that's happened so far. So I wanted to just kind of level set in terms of thinking about an overall structure of piecing together what our final destination is and the different pieces of evidence and data available that's, and I'll talk a little bit briefly about how to access it. So our ultimate outcome is adaptation plan, and it should be cost effective, ideally informed by data and evidence, as Shuchi had referred to. It should be right-sized, so we're not investing too much, we're not under-investing, and this is going to cut across all sectors. So this could be in agriculture in terms of selecting the appropriate crop types or seed varieties based on the amount of precipitation or temperature extremes that a location will face. It could be addressing the range of urban cooling options to address urban heat island effects, coastal defenses against sea level rise. Essentially, any sector where there's a climate risk, there's going to be some adaptation planning components. So we start off with a scenario. So if we're thinking about sort of generating a suite of data that informs climate impacts, that's informed by some set of assumptions about what the future population looks like, how emissions intensive that population is in generating goods and services. What does the economy look like? Are people driving are people driving electric vehicles? Are people riding bicycles? Or is everybody driving big trucks and low fuel economy vehicles? Once you have those scenarios, you can then populate or drive a general circulation model or a GCM. These are these big computational climate models that are run on supercomputers that give us a forecast of what future precipitation, future temperature, air pressure, any component that factors into the climate system gets exported from these large models that ultimately get run out over very long time scales. So we could get a climate forecast for the year 2040, and then some of these climate models get run out all the way through the year 2300, simply for the purpose of diagnosing sort of the accuracy and quality of model output. Now, the problem with some of these global climate models that Shuchi had referred to is that their resolution, sort of like the pixel size in which that data gets exported, are pretty large. What that means is that anybody in a 100-kilometer by 100-kilometer square gets the same value, even though we know that weather changes quite radically on the distance of just a few kilometers. So there's been a lot of advance in the past several decades of downscaling, of shifting from a general global focus to a regional focus. And ultimately, you have a range of efforts scattered across the planet that focus on specific continent or regions in generating what are presumably higher quality, more accurate regional forecasts. So this is an example for South Asia, East Asia, where the geographic scope is limited to the countries that are shown here in this model. Now, the output of these models is, what is the temperature? What's the precipitation going to be? That's not ideally appropriate for some of the questions that are over here on the right about which agricultural practices to shift to or what types of urban cooling. We need a sectoral model that translates those climate outputs into something that's immediately more usable. So here is an example of this variable infiltration capacity model. This is a hydrological model. So you would be able to map the topography of a location, bring in the precipitation forecast, and identify what areas will be flooded, how long will they be flooded, what's the probability of flooding based on the precipitation forecast that's generated from either your regional model or your global model. Now, I want to underscore that data availability, at least on this side, is not the problem. There's lots of data available, and that quantity has been increasing over the last 30 years. So you can see this is a log scale showing, really significant increases in the number of projects. So these are the different modeling institutions that generate climate models, the different types of experiments that are run. Do we double CO2 concentrations? Do we see an annual increase for the next 100 years? Really teasing out all the fine dynamics involved in the climate system. So as time has passed, there are more teams generating models at both the global and the regional level. The resolution, sort of the pixel size of those climate model outputs is getting smaller and smaller, which enables scientists to capture important dynamics that just had been elusive under previous generations with less sophisticated computational power in understanding of the climate systems. So I want to just really underscore that there is a lot of data to work with, and this in itself can present a challenge when thinking about how to integrate these outputs into adaptation planning. So there are numerous modeling centers scattered across the planet that contribute to these efforts. So for the most recent IPCC report, these are the institutions, universities, and government agencies that generate models on a regular basis. And any of the institutions here labeled in purple participate in Cordex. Cordex is a joint activity which generates those regional models. So in addition to simply having sort of a blanket model that provides global coverage, these are locations that are really focusing on providing presumably more useful or finer resolution products that are specific for regional planning purposes. So I think one way that's helpful in addressing sort of the connection between these different phases of climate data is in terms of how actionable they are. So simply grabbing a temperature output or soil moisture content, specific humidity from your climate models doesn't tell communities, which crops they should be growing or what degree of concern they should have in water salinity or urban flooding. We need to go from left to right in making sense in being able to inform specific actions. So on the far left, we begin with that global model output. Then we can think about summarizing the data over a particular season, over a particular year. So if I know that a crop, say maize or millet, suffers big yield losses once the maximum daily temperature exceeds some threshold, I'd want to know how many days for my growing season are going to exceed that threshold. So I know if this is the right crop to be growing or if I should be shifting to something that's more heat tolerant. Now, lastly, when we bring in some of those sectoral or impact modeling approaches, we've translated those climate forecasts into something that's much more usable. What is the probability that my city or my neighborhood will face flooding? What is the forecast for food security based on the availability of rainfall at the times that I need, and based on the temperature that my crops are going to be exposed to? So there's this value add as we move from left to right in making sense in being used for locally led adaptation and adaptation more generally. So I wanted to provide an example of one tool. So this is developed by CGIAR. This is called their Climate Wizard. And this is an effort to make a lot of that data output accessible. So whereas traditionally the climate model data is used by earth scientists, folks who can program in a range of languages, it hasn't been accessible for communities or for interested individuals to find out what are the climate impacts in my location, what are the climate impacts that I should be focusing on. So in this tool, a user can select a polygon. So here I've arbitrarily drawn a polygon around Chittagong. And if I'm interested in knowing what is the number of wet days or the number of warm nights for a period of interest, here the default is 2026 to 2045, with no programming required, I can go ahead and select those buttons and get results for that area of interest. This is a huge advance because previously there were large barriers to entry for people being able to draw this data in. So this is really exciting. But one of the complications is that over here on the right side, there's a drop-down menu for climate model options. And you see a lot of options there. And in an earlier slide, I showed that there were numerous institutions that are producing those climate models. This creates a question of choice. Do I trust some models more than others? How do I combine the models when they tell me different things? Maybe one tells me that rainfall is going to increase by 20% and the other says it's going to decrease by 5%. How do I make sense of those multiple models that could be providing conflicting advice? So I wanted to share an example of one approach that we used for a project that was examining the impacts of natural resource conservation in Malawi, where we wanted to drive a hydrological model to understand changes in stream flow from Malawi's key river, the Shiri Basin River. So what we had done is we took precip data across the range of regional climate models that was available, compared it against observed historical rainfall. So those models that did a good job of reproducing actually observed historical rainfall patterns presumably would also do a better job of predicting future rainfall because they've captured some of the local dynamics specific to that context. So in this particular approach, because both from looking at a daily rainfall basis as well as a monthly rainfall basis, these two models at the top right were the ones that we ended up selecting for our analysis. So I just wanted to close with a few thoughts, both in thinking about the bright spots as well as future requirements. So one bright spot is that there's definitely growing interest by governments, foundations, other donors to develop climate data products and make them more accessible to broader audiences. These platforms are becoming more user-friendly, and a lot of them don't require programming expertise, which really increases their overall accessibility and ability to be used in some of the climate planning and adaptation design phases that we've talked about so far. I think that there is significant interest in modeling impacts across all sectors. So no matter what sector of the economy or the community you're interested in, there should be folks who are developing products to support that. In terms of moving forward, interdisciplinary teams is going to be essential, and Shuchi had definitely alluded to this, that it's going to require folks with different expertise to come together to interpret and translate that data and determine how, in fact, that evidence informs the adaptation planning that needs to happen to respond to those climate forecasts. There's also a big need for open access decision support tools. So really lowering the cost of converting some of those forecasts into what should we do, what should we fund. And lastly, there are at all stages of this model interpretation process, big questions of uncertainty. What is the future economy going to look like? What does the future level of CO2 concentrations look like? We have huge amounts of uncertainty that we're working through at each stage of this value add process. And so there's going to be a need to communicate that and to identify how that uncertainty is responded to in climate action plans. So I'll leave it there and really look forward to continuing this conversation, and I'll go ahead and stop my slides.
Thanks so much, Anthony. Lots of very interesting information and lots of follow-up questions that we'll get to. Anand, I want to turn to you. As you saw in the opening remarks by Sabrina, we talked about cases where the hot tin roofs become so hot that they have to sleep outside, they're sleep deprived, they're not able to get to work. The houses are getting regularly flooded. And when you think about these communities and you're thinking about adaptation planning, it's clear that the level of financing needed to support their interventions is going to be a lot more than the resources that they have. So just if you could bring some information on that topic to this group about what are the climate adaptation finance flows, what do the conditions look like, how do they really get transferred to sub-national actors and to local actors. So over to you, Anand, on some of those points. Anand, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. All right, I hope you can hear me now. Great. Thanks so much, Tulika, and thanks so much good to see old friends and Salim and others and Sheila on this call, and very happy to be back in this forum at Gobeshona, as always. So a couple of things sort of building on the inputs we have heard so far in the session. The first thing I'd like to start with is Anthony presented some really interesting work on how we bring climate data or the right kind of climate data and information into support planning and action. And I'd actually like to start with that, but argue that we actually need to invert that process. That we should not be starting with climate data. We should actually be starting with the decisions that are being made, whether it's by communities that are responding, whether it's by households who are thinking about what to do, whether it's about local governments who are thinking about what their decisions are. So I think it's really important for us to first almost invert that process and start with decisions that are being made today and ask the question, how are those decisions likely to be influenced if you consider climate change? And what might we do differently? What might we do the same? What might we do more of? And so really, I think putting that emphasis on decisions also then, in a sense, makes the focus on the locally led, on the communities, right? So it's not so much the climate scientists trying to figure out, okay, here's all the wonderful data sets from CMIP6 and Cordex that we have produced. Now, someone, we have done our bit. Now, someone figure out what to do with it, but rather sort of invert that process and saying, okay, I'm a community and I'm facing some challenges right now with regard to resources, with regard to development issues, with regard to a whole range of problems that we are confronting, and those problems are linked to climate variability and climate change. And how do we now make sense of that in the context of our decision problems? I think that's kind of the first point I wanted to make. The second is we've heard quite a lot of conversation today about evidence and information. The two things I haven't heard as much, but which are really important when it comes to the question of finance. One thing is I've heard about climate, but I haven't heard as much about risk. And risk is a little bit different from just the climate hazard. Risk is really a construct that involves not just the climate hazard, but involves the exposure of the community, involves how we are able to adjust to those hazards. And that brings in a whole range of other issues where, again, I think communities are front and center because they understand what their exposure is. They understand what their capacity is. They understand what they're doing right now in terms of coping and adjusting. And all of that is quite central. So when we think about, for example, future vulnerability, that future vulnerability is not only going to be driven by the evolution of future climate, but it's also going to be driven by how communities are going to continually adjust and adapt as they go along. You know, as we've heard from Sushi, communities are not, they're moving, they're changing, and they're changing in many ways. And that change, that underlying, so if you think about it as layers in a GIS, the climate layer is changing, but so is the exposure layer tremendously. And so is the ability to respond, the capacity layer of what communities can and are able to do. And the ultimate risk that households and individuals and communities face is the combination of all of those layers. And that's the dynamic when it comes to the future, which is really challenging. So that's kind of my second point. The third thing I haven't heard as much, but which is also very central, I think, when it comes to finance, is the question of effectiveness. So a lot of the times and I think Shuchi did mention this, a lot of the times our monitoring and evaluation systems are focused on accountability. Have you spent the money for the purpose for which you said you will spend it? Which is an important question, but maybe an even more important question is, have the money you spent actually provided you results? And what has it benefited you? And what have you learned from that process? So I think that really calls for a very different approach to thinking about monitoring and evaluation to support questions of learning, to support questions of effectiveness. A lot of the times what we are seeing now in the case of adaptation is what I like to call as immersion practices. They're not best practices because we actually don't know what is best. Right? We don't have good evidence for what works. We're trying many things. We have some idea that things might work, but we need to much more systematically understand questions of effectiveness if we have to then convince people to make larger investments. And so that then brings me sort of to my final point on the finance side, which is, different audiences have very different expectations in terms of evidence, or even what they consider as valid evidence, right? So if I were to go and talk to a finance minister, or if I were to go and talk to a investment banker, the first question they will ask me is questions about return on investment. They'll ask me questions about benefit cost ratios. They'll ask me questions about does this particular intervention work? How can you tell me that it is actually producing? I'm getting value for money. And these are questions which require, I think, different kinds of evidence. So different audiences require different evidence. But this is also evidence that is very much rooted in the experience and in the outcomes that are experienced by communities and the users. This is not, again, top down. This has to come very much from a bottom up sort of perspective of saying, what is it that is the lived experience of communities? What does that tell us about outcomes? How do they see their well-being change over time to understand whether interventions are working or they feel that they're becoming more resilient or not? Right. And so that's again something that cannot happen unless we almost invert that whole data collection approach and evidence generation approach to put communities at the center of that process. So let me just sort of wrap this up with a call out perhaps to another set of principles. So we've heard about the locally led adaptation principles, the LLA principles. But as sort of wearing my hat as the co-chair of the Adaptation Research Alliance, and I recognize Suchi and Tulika and many others here, and Sheila herself, and Salim, who are all part of the ARA. But one of the things that the ARA tried to do was very early on is develop a set of adaptation research for impact principles, which were really about not just reorienting that whole process of research to make it, transform it, and make it user-centered, make it demand-driven, make it not just the change what the research is, but also how it is carried out. And this, I think, aligns very well with the emphasis we have heard right from the beginning of this particular session on not just what data are collected, how they're, but also how they're generated, who generates them, who has agency, who controls that information, and then who determines sort of what it is used for and in what way. So I kind of just wanted to make a call out to that as well. Thanks, Tulika.
Thanks a lot, Anand. And I think your last point about Adaptation Research Alliance, can you all hear me?
We could, although you froze for a second.
Okay. Well, perhaps my video has stopped working, but anyways, I'll continue to speak if you can all hear me. That was very helpful, and essentially, Anand, the comments around effectiveness are really important, and I would say that over here at Mathematica, that's one of the key things we aim for, which is rigorous and reliable evidence, and we hope that we believe that the idea of generating that rigorous evidence needs to consider all the information, and it stands the test of time, and it stands the test of whichever stakeholder is looking at it, right? So from every direction, the evidence doesn't change based on who's looking at it. It needs to incorporate all the pieces. I do want to ask a question back to you, Anand, because I know you have to hop off a bit early. I know we all changed time zones, so things messed up for you a bit. You talked about towards the end about the different audiences for the finance, and talking about returns of investment, benefit cost ratio, I mean, sort of the way to get to that effectiveness. I see them all procedurally from a methods perspective, all coming to the same point. But I know that there is a little bit of a tussle in the community around what is climate adaptation and how is that different from business as usual work that we do under the overseas development support and, elevating people out of poverty. And, in our earlier conversation with Sabrina, I mean, if you really go to the communities and ask them, what is your core problem? At the end of the day, the core problem is the economic conditions that they are facing. And as you mentioned, those economic conditions make the biggest impact on how the climate risk translates into the outcomes that we see. So say a little bit more about what, when you're talking about locally led adaptation, when you're talking about supporting that work and bringing adaptation finance, what is it that the local actors or subnational entities need to take into account when they're seeking those funds, and how can we increase the flow of those funds to the areas with greatest need and impact?
Thanks very much, Tulika. Again, as I said, my apologies, but I, with this time zone change, has kind of, created some unforeseen consequences. But coming back to your point, I think there's sort of two thoughts I wanted to leave, and they may be a little controversial, so I'm going to leave the thoughts and then step away from the controversy that it creates. But so let me start by saying that at the bottom up level, right? So when it comes to actually sort of action on the ground, this whole dichotomy that we often created between adaptation and development is a bit of a false dichotomy. Like a lot of the interventions that we are doing are ultimately addressing fundamental structural development questions, whether it is addressing questions of inclusion, equity, gender, livelihoods. These are kind of basic fundamental developmental questions, right? So a lot of the time, the actual content of what we might do on the ground doesn't seem very different from what we might call as, kind of good development. I think the challenge really is then when you take this idea up the scale into the multilateral process. And I think that's where really the challenge has been in the multilateral climate finance, in trying to draw a very sharp distinction, and this is what bodies like the Green Climate Fund try and do when they insist on very rigorous climate rationales, is they are trying to essentially draw a very hard line, let's put it that way, between what is adaptation and what is development. And I don't want to get into the details of why that is. I mean, there may actually be good reasons from a variety of perspectives, but the net result of that is it has two effects. The first is you are essentially raising what in trade we call non-tariff barriers. You're essentially creating a high barrier to entry to projects, especially when it starts to coming from the community-based or locally led efforts, because you're basically putting in requirements that are onerous, that often are front-loaded. You don't have resources to address those requirements. So essentially, you're creating these sort of entry barriers to projects. And then the second thing you're doing is, in some sense, then the whole process of actual delivery of resources becomes slowed down, right? So we might say, well, we have mobilized resources for adaptation, but those resources are not flowing because there are essentially barriers created to that flow. And this is, I think, a real problem. And I think at some level, this is something that requires technical solutions, but also political solutions to recognize that, at the end, what we are doing in adaptation is often addressing key developmental deficits, and that's central. Now we have to do it in a way that is climate sensitive or that is climate informed, but otherwise it creates this dichotomy. And then the only other thing I'll say is that there are in fact some interesting experiments underway right now, one of which involves the ERA with the Avina Foundation called BASE, which is in fact trying to figure out, are there alternative ways of providing this climate rationale or evidence of climate impact, which could satisfy donors. But I think this is really a big problem. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Anand. And I realize you may have to hop off, but thank you so much for your comments and leaving us with two controversial items to discuss further. So I will turn to questions to some of the other panelists, and I'm picking up a little bit from the chat also on the questions coming up. Well, which is essentially, Shuchi, going back to you and also what Sabrina said, that what data would be most useful to develop the community plan? And is the gap more about data or analytical support? And I want to sort of add a layer to this particular question, because based on all the comments that I heard, I mean, and even what Anand said, that, we need to start with where the decisions are being made. We need to start where the communities are. But at the same time, I would say that while we start there, the role of climate data, the role of climate forecast is vital, right? I mean, the decisions are being made in Khulna today because of this persistent flooding, because of this increasing heat. So climate is such a huge thing facing humanity that we are making decisions about what to do next. And one part which I feel in the conversations about when we go at the local level is there's a lot of understanding about which road is getting flooded, which communities are affected and how. But I wonder about the information about what does this climate variability look like in the future, 5 years down the road, what are things going to be like? Is that the data gap? Is that the data need? So that's one question. And then the question that came in the chat about, is there also a need about the analytical support? So I'll start with you, Shuchi, and I have a follow-up question picking up from the Q&A for Anne.
Sure, difficult ones to answer, especially about what is the data gap? Is it climate data? Is it so? There's no two ways about the fact that climate data is a gap, and I guess to a certain extent, it's our abilities to anticipate what challenges will come across in the near and not so distant future are challenges that we are all kind of trying to rise up to, right? So that's definitely, to various extents, that's a gap. Having said that, large scale absence of data cannot be addressed without ground truthing that data, right? We have satellite data, we're doing very well with, and we're making great advances with satellite data, but from personal experience, even very high resolution data sets based out of expensive satellite data sets require ground truthing, because at the end of the day, it's a triangulation that'll actually that'll actually ensure that that data is useful, right? So that's one. And the role of the communities, when I say they're users and producers, it's not a question of whether climate data is useful or not, but there is a possibility to take them on as equal partners in this process of ground truthing that data. There is a possibility of training them on knowledge and information, so how they can apply that data. For instance, weather sensors, Internet of Things. There are various ways, WhatsApp chatbots. There are various ways in which they can be included, and we have the technology for it. It's just about, innovating and thinking through how we do that. And I think going back to what I said earlier and going back to what Anand said as well, he reiterated the point that I made around flipping it to decisions. And what are the decisions that we need rather than what's the risk that we are adapting to? If we know that these are the decision gaps and these are the data gaps for us to make particular decisions, we will be able to create scenarios to different kinds of risks, and therefore be better prepared and be more flexible in our approach to making decisions rather than get locked in. Our current approach and the way we've been approaching climate change is figuring out solutions where we lock ourselves in, and then it's too late to turn back, and then we're just in situations which are maladaptive. And that's like Anand was pointing out, that's A, issues of effectiveness, and B, issues of also of vulnerabilities shifting, and we probably are making those communities more vulnerable by locking ourselves into solutions. And I think that's critical. That's one, and goes back, I think it also answers to a certain extent the question around decision support and how we can support communities. I think our role is in facilitating that process, facilitating those scenarios, treating communities as equal partners in ensuring that those data gaps are met, taking in those decisions and translating them into what are those data gaps. That's also something that we as experts can do, and those are the roles that we need to play. I think we need to play the role of listeners rather than speakers or communicators of risk. When there are enough and more people talking about climate risk, nobody listening, and nobody really ensuring that we're listening to what kind of decisions need to be made, and then translating those into the kind of scenarios needed. So yeah, I think flips
Thanks a lot, Shuchi. That's really helpful. And as you were speaking, one question that came up from the audience, which I think teased this up well, is, you were making a comment, Shuchi, about the importance of ground truthing. And as Sabrina was making the presentation and we saw the details around the map, the detail at which the flooding happens. And Anthony, up front in your slide, you were talking about all the different steps that need to happen to do sectoral modeling, and you're modeling flooding. And it seems to me that these maps and these data that are being generated at the local level to understand the flooding at the level of detail is some sort of a ground truthing possibly, or not, is the question back to you, Anthony, because can these data be integrated in a more systematic way to present sort of an idea of where's the flooding happening at this point of time based on the community's own mapping and experiences? Can we get a little bit more detail around the urban heat islands by the reporting that they provide? And then tee that up with this question that's also in the chat about how do you then make all this data and accessible to different types of community, and what are the gaps in doing that?
Yeah, I agree. I think that it can and it should, but I think that there are a few caveats that are important to keep in mind. One is that in some contexts, there's still a lot of development that will happen, and that's going to change the underlying fundamentals of the system. So for example, if we are putting together a crowdsourced citizen science map of flooding, and yet we haven't accounted for the fact that there will be new paving that will take place that shifts what is a permeable surface to an impervious surface, or we will have new skyscrapers and other buildings or just other structures that are constructed that alters the water flow and the storm water discharge sort of dynamics. That means that we could be devising approaches that were appropriate to the way that a settlement looked last year, but is not appropriate to how the settlement looks 10 years from now. So having that evolutionary process in mind, I think, is going to be essential. In some places, like in much of the US, where there's just very little construction and on a year-to-year basis, there's not much difference in terms of the profile of impacts that contribute to sort of stormwater or rainwater, then maybe that evolutionary is not going to be central. But if I'm thinking about some large primate cities that have 3% year-on-year population growth, this is super dynamic. So that's one aspect. Another, I think, is that some of the insights generated from that community data collection effort can then identify where are places where more systematic data collection could take place. So I would prefer, instead of sort of relying on sort of the recall of individual households, to be able to prioritize locations where maybe we then install sensors or monitors. Then we would be able to say, when we have 2 inches of rainfall or 5 millimeters of rainfall in a 24-hour period, these are the places that get flooded, but these other places don't. And for that to actually be a byproduct of some continuous data collection. But of course, I think getting that community input in saying these are places that are more likely to flood can help prioritize where to place those sensors. So I think that it's definitely a case that we should incorporate that knowledge and that information, but it still needs to go through a few intermediating steps in order to be maximally effective.
Thanks. I want to go back then to the point that I think almost all panelists have made and recognized and is important, which is that we need to start with the decision-making point. So I want to go back to Sabrina, Shireen, with your help, and want to ask Sabrina, what are the kinds of decisions that communities are trying to take? In Khulna, when the mapping is going on, we're trying to understand the risk. So what does that look like? So let's bring that to life a little bit further.
সাবরিনা আপা আছেন আমাদের সাথে, শুনতে পাচ্ছেন?
আমার একটু কাজ আছে তাই বলবো।
হ্যালো, I guess she's not around. Hello, Sabrina আপা?
জি আপা।
জি আপা, একটা ছোট প্রশ্ন আপনার জন্য করলেন, যদি একটু ছোট করে বলেন যে আপনারা যেই মানে ম্যাপটা ডেভেলপ করে যে তথ্যগুলি পান, সেই তথ্যগুলা কমিউনিটির নারীরা বা কমিউনিটি সদস্যরা মানে সাথে সাথে ব্যবহার করেছে, এরকম কোন একটা উদাহরণ কি দিতে পারেন? যে কিভাবে ব্যবহার করেছে, ধরেন একটা ম্যাপ থেকে তারা দেখতে পেলো যে কোনো এক জায়গার এই রাস্তাগুলো হয়তো বা জলাবদ্ধতার শিকার হবে বেশি বৃষ্টিপাত হলে, তখন সেই তথ্যটা দিয়ে তারা পরবর্তীতে কি করেছে, আসলে কি ধরনের ডিসিশন নিয়েছে সেটা সমাধানের জন্য?
ওটা আসলে সমাধানের জন্য আপা যখন দেখা গেছে যে জলাবদ্ধতা হয়েছে, তখন আমরা যখন বিভিন্ন সংস্থারা কাজ করে তখন তাদেরকে জানাই, যেমন ড্রেনের উপরে স্ল্যাব ছিল না আমাদের এখানে আপা, ড্রেন গুলোর উপরে স্ল্যাব ছিল না, রাস্তাগুলো ওখানে ছোট ছোট যে রাস্তাগুলো আছে সেই রাস্তাগুলো নিচু ছিল। তখন আমরা বিভিন্ন সংস্থার সাথে লিঙ্কেজ করে কিন্তু এই সমস্যাগুলোর সাথে সাথে আমরা মানে সমাধানের চেষ্টা করছি এবং কিছু কাজও আমরা করছি।
এবং
মানে
সাথে
ড্রেনের
উপকারও
উপর
পেয়েছেন।
স্ল্যাব দিছি, হ্যাঁ ড্রেনের উপর স্ল্যাব দিছি এবং যে ছোট ছোট রাস্তাগুলো আছে কাঁচা ছিল সেগুলো পাকা করে।
Okay, thank you, Appa. So I basically asked her, like, the data that they generate from the maps, what were the immediate uses of these data by the community themselves. So she picked up a particular example of, identifying some roads which are, which remain waterlogged during the heavy rainfall and, disrupts the communication. So what they did is that they identified those locations from the map and then went to the, the respective authorities, or sometimes took help of other, better established NGOs. For example, some roads like were not paved, were like, the what do you call it, the earthen roads, which are, we in Bangla we call it the kacha roads, and those are more vulnerable to, having clogged, waterlogged, or some drains didn't have the slabs. So they identified the problems and also the solutions, and then they went to the respective authorities with support from other organizations, and with their lobbying together with the other partners have actually helped them, resolve those problems.
Thanks a lot, Shireen. I think that rounds up the reflections really well to begin and end with Sabrina's thoughts and comments. I did want to sort of close the session. I know we are a few minutes away, but would like to invite Salim, if you would make some closing remarks for the group based on what you heard, that would be lovely.
Thank you very much, Stacey, for that, and a very, very interesting discussion. I'm trying to sort of get my head around, triangulating the three constituencies that I see trying to communicate with each other. One being the technical constituency, those of us who do research, collect data, analyze data. We love doing that. And then there is the community itself that is suffering the problems and trying to address those problems as best they can, but have limited recourse on their own and need assistance. And then there are the authorities who are supposed to provide that assistance, decision makers at local political level, bureaucratic level, and then higher levels of bureaucracy and politics as well. And I see the triangulation of a broader term than just data, evidence. I like the use of the word evidence as a combination of quantitative information, qualitative information, but it presented in a way that is easily communicated and understood by whoever it is we are presenting it to. And the challenge then for all of us is, and I like Tuchi's set a recommendation for researchers like ourselves to listen to people before we talk and get a sense of what it is that they are grappling with, what is a priority for them, and then figure out, what is our skill set that we can bring to help them and assist them and work with them to generate that kind of information on a regular basis, not just one-off. So climate change is never going to be a one-off problem. It's not a cyclone problem. It is, future cyclones that are going to come. And so my final thought here is the potential for using young people in the community and training them up to be able to become, if you like, barefoot or local level skilled evidence collectors, both in the quantitative as well as in the qualitative sense, and capacitating them. They could be students in colleges locally or even in high school, but they're local. They're part of the community. And can we upskill them in the more scientific side of capacity building that we do, but also they are part of the community and they can be the interpreters and the two-way interpreters for us and for them. So I think it's worth thinking about young people from the community being trained and capacitated as the collectors of information, the interlocutors, the sharers, and over time becoming leaders themselves at the local level. Anyway, a few thoughts from my side, but very stimulating conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks for those closing remarks. Anju, do you want to officially close?
Nothing for me to say, but thank you, everybody. Thank you for participating and look forward to taking the conversation forward. Thank you. Bye.